I really just want to thank you guys for your patience with me and this video series as we finally wrap up the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship. Back in 2021, towards the end of 2021, I signed up for my first monthly subscription box that I was paying for myself because I am a rep for a number of boxes. And so I wanted to find a way to hold myself accountable to actually read the books that I was getting in this subscription while I was paying for it every single month. So I started a series of vlogs that was called Is the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship Worth My Money? Now, the only reason why I did this was to hold myself accountable. I was interested in the quantifiable results, like comparing my ratings across the books and deciding ultimately whether this subscription was worth my money. But my sole intention when doing it was just to hold myself accountable. I never expected the answer to be no, it wasn't. So across 18 months, it was supposed to be 12, it got extended. I procrastinated a lot and only just wrapped up the final vlog in this series. But I read all of the books in like quarterly installments. Like I said, some of them were delayed, from September 2021 through to February 2023. I compiled all of the ratings in a chart, and the pass mark for this vlog series was 50% above a 4-star or higher. So I had to give half of the books, 9 of the books, a 4 or 5-star rating. And today, while I've been sharing the results as we've been going along, today I am going to share with you guys my final results and final thoughts on the subscription as a whole, and definitively answer the question, is the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship worth my money? So winding it back a little bit in case you guys are unfamiliar with what the subscription is, the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship is, as you can probably imagine, a science fiction and fantasy monthly subscription from Goldsboro Books. Goldsboro Books are a bookshop. They have very few actual in-person shops. I think there's one in London, one in Brighton. I'm not sure if there's actually any more than that. And they are a bookstore that specialize in signed first editions. So with the Goldsboro subscription, this is just some of the books that I read behind me. There's 18 of them, so I have them stacked around, but every book is a signed and numbered first edition in an exclusive edition to Goldsboro. They're not the fanciest special editions. Some of them were a little bit more reworked, including probably my favorite book from this subscription. It's probably also the best edition in terms of how it looks, but they all have like a sprayed edge or something a little bit different about them as well. You are allowed to skip some of the books, so you don't have to get all of them. For the purpose of this experiment, I did get all of the Goldsboro books across the 18 months to kind of like make it fair, but you are allowed 4 skips. And the subscription, when I signed up, I think was limited to 1,500 spots. It has since been expanded to 2,000, and I think it is currently still at 2,000 copies per month. So it's quite an exclusive one. You do also get extra benefits with the Goldsboro subscription, which I really like, and I like to take advantage of those. You get pre-sale on some of the stuff, like they've done some fantasy romance sets like the Raven Kennedy Plated Prisoner set. There was early access for that, and there was only 1,000 copies of that set available. And they also do a 15% discount on any science fiction and fantasy titles from them. So you're essentially getting brand new hardbacks at brand new hardback prices. They don't mark them up that much, with a 15% discount, which, as somebody who really likes and reads mainly sci-fi and fantasy, is also a really cool perk. So to run through all of the books that I read for this project very quickly and kind of in order but probably not quite, we had Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn, All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman, The Actual Star by Monica Byrne, Absinthe by Brendan P. Bellecourt, The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan, Age of Ash by Daniel Abraham, Wild and Wicked Things by Francesca May, The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield, Collarbone by Rebecca Zahavi, Lost in Time by A.G. Riddle, Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro, Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi, Mindwalker by Kate Dillon, Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chapeko, The Immortality Thief by Taron Hunt, City of Lost Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky, The Witch and the Tsar by Alessia Selenikova Gilmore, and Shield Maiden by Sharon Emmerich. So I do have my original ratings from the time that I was reading these books and where I placed them on the chart. So as you can see, we already just were not meeting. Like, the base standard was just not happening. Now, since I started this project, I took a big gap between the 5th and the 6th installment, and since then I have adjusted my rating system a little bit. So I decided it would be interesting to see what this would look like if it reflected my new rating style, and also a little bit of hindsight, because I have rated books in the past and given them a rating that, like, as time goes on, I either think about them more and think I should have rated them higher, or I've realized that I was kind of just in the moment and maybe they weren't actually as good as they were at the time that I was reading them. So I readjusted the ratings to display how I feel about them now and how I feel they would be rated if I had read them now, and it looks like this. So it's kind of got worse for a lot of books in this chart. It doesn't actually really matter which one of these tables that we decide to go with, because I'm still going with the base mark. I still think it's very fair, like it's a reasonable ask, that half of the books that I read in this subscription would be rated above a 4-star. And even if we go with the original table, the most generous of the two, we only have 5 books that actually meet that criteria. And in my opinion, paying, I think this subscription is it £26 a month or £27 a month for me, including postage. That's not a good enough ratio for me to keep this subscription. To be transparent, I do still have this subscription, but I utilize my skips very wisely. So I get the books that I'm interested in, that I want signed and numbered editions of, and the rest I just skip. Of all of these books as well, like 1/3 of them I actually DNF'd. So more books than I rated 4 stars I did not finish. Some of these I DNF'd like really early on as well. Actually, I think the majority of them I did, because I am very persistent, I am very stubborn, and it does actually a lot of the time take me a lot to DNF a book. So for me to DNF these early on was pretty much just me identifying in the first 100 pages that they really weren't for me, and it probably wasn't going to improve over time, which, while I did want to keep this fair, the idea was to find out whether these books in the subscription were worth my money, not to torture myself. So I do also feel like the DNFs are valid. If we go with the original ratings, 2 of the books that I read I gave 2 stars to. With the reworked ratings, I am a lot more generous, if generous is the word. So if I read these books now, we would end up with 4 2-star ratings. I gave 5 3-star ratings. In the reworked graph we had 4, and I gave 5 4 stars. Once again, in the rework I had 4. So in the rework it's actually a pretty even split. I'm sad that we didn't have any 5 stars, but we also didn't have any 1 stars, which partially could be due to me DNFing a lot of the ones that I just thought really wasn't for me, but also I don't give 1 stars very often at all. So I feel like if I had finished the DNFs, we would probably have just ended up with a lot of 2s. Now, to split this down in a different way, how many of these books am I actually keeping? Because a 3-star read means that I enjoyed it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have any desire to continue on with the series if it is in a series, or I have any desire to keep these on my shelves when I could save that space or give that space to other books on my TBR, or books that I've enjoyed a little bit more. And I'm pretty sad to say actually that out of the 18 books that I read, I think I'm only going to be keeping 4 of them. These are the ones that I truly enjoyed, and one of them is a 3-star, so even a 4-star doesn't even guarantee that I'm going to be keeping the book. These 4, I'm really glad that I read through this subscription. There are 2 that I'm currently unsure about. They are The Actual Star by Monica Byrne. I'm unsure about this because it's a standalone, and while I really enjoyed it and I took a lot from it, I don't really think I'll reread this. So this one will probably stay on my shelves for a little bit, but it may get on hold eventually. And the other one is The Immortality Thief by Taron Hunt, which is a very fun, fast-paced sci-fi horror. This one I enjoyed while I was reading it. I thought it was a standalone. It's actually the first book in a series. I don't know if the sequel's out, but I think by the time the sequel is out, I want to have made the decision whether I'll continue on with this series, and if not, then I will also be unhauling The Immortality Thief. So that leaves 12 books. 2/3 of this subscription that I paid for month by month, I am going to be unhauling. But also, how many of these am I glad that I read? Because just because I enjoyed a book, just because I gave it 3 stars or more, doesn't mean that I necessarily feel like I would have missed anything if I hadn't have read them. And of those, we have 5, so just slightly over a quarter. It's the same as the ones that I'm keeping, except The Immortality Thief, while I had a good time while I was reading it, I feel like I could do without it. So that means that there were 6 books that I read for this vlog project that I I don't regret reading them necessarily, or not all of them, but I would have been fine or happy if I had decided to DNF or these books had just never really crossed my path. Now, I obviously only read these books because of the subscription, and one of the reasons actually that I signed up, the main reason I signed up to the Goldsboro subscription at all, is because I feel like I get a lot of books and I see a lot of books on BookTube, on Instagram, and that really influences what books I pick up. At this point, with having so many books around me at all times, I don't really go out of my way to read a synopsis and decide if a book sounds good and then buy it exclusively on that. And I also don't spend a whole lot of time reading books that I've heard nothing about just because I think I might like them. So it's hard to say how many books I would have potentially picked up if it was not for this subscription, but I think I can narrow it down to 7 that there was a good chance that I could have picked up, that I could have read, or at least purchased if it wasn't for the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship. And the interesting thing about this is that 4 of these books are ones that I either DNF'd, didn't like, or will definitely be unhauling anyway. So of those ones, we have The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. I heard a lot of people talking very highly about this, but it has a very murder mystery plot and a classic murder mystery plot as well, which is something you guys know I really do not like in fantasy, but that's something also that I've really discovered about myself as something I definitely don't enjoy through reading like this or trying to read this for the subscription. Among Thieves was a book about an assassin, which is always a buzzword for me and something that I definitely thought that I was going to enjoy, but ultimately this fell flat, and I felt like by the end of it, like the characters hadn't really achieved anything at all. It was also marketed as a standalone. I have not looked this book up since I read it, but at the time of reading it, I couldn't see any plans for a sequel to be released either. So this on its own is very much nothing. Like it doesn't even stand as a self-contained story in my opinion. So this one I feel like was kind of a waste of time me reading. One that I would have potentially picked up because I have read from and enjoyed books by the author before is Silver and Nightfall by Rin Chupeco. This was one of the ones in the vlog installments that I predicted would have been one of my favorites, and I DNF'd this. This is probably the one that I DNF'd the furthest in. I think I made it around 200 pages, but I like historical fantasy, but not necessarily like this. I'm picky about my historical fantasy is something that I've learned. Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro is one that was relatively hyped. Quite a few people were talking about it. I have to say I do really like the cover of this one. This is once again a historical fantasy, but it is also once again not a type of historical fantasy that I like, and this one I felt was just a little bit too long and a little bit too boring for my tastes. For me personally, it may not have been boring for you, but I was bored. The Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi. This has been published by Harper Voyager, which I think Harper Voyager are my favorite fantasy publisher. I tend to have the best look. Like a lot of my favorite fantasy books have been published by Harper Voyager. So this would have potentially been on my radar, but like I said, I don't tend to pick up books from authors that I've heard nothing about. And this book is underrated, guys. I loved this book. This is one of the best starts to a adult fantasy book series that I've read in a long time. And I've read the sequel as well, and the sequel holds up. I gave them both 4 stars. If you haven't read this, you're sleeping on it. I can't say whether I definitely would have picked this up without this subscription. There would have been a good chance I would have seen it and been intrigued, but whether I actually picked it up when I have so many other books on my shelves, so many other books to get to, is a different matter. So this one I am truly thankful to the subscription for. All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman was also a potential for me to have picked up, mainly because I have read something by Christine Lynn Herman before and really enjoyed it. I've read The Devouring Grey, and I also really like the dark kind of Death Eater atmosphere in this one. And then the last one, The Collarbone by Rebecca Zahabi. This one I feel like I would have seen around, potentially looked into. I'm not sure whether that I would have actually purchased it though, because once again, this is a book that I've heard pretty much nothing about, nobody talk about it. I really enjoyed it, but I don't know if this would have reached me based on what I see like on the internet and what I see around me and based on the way that I buy books. I think I've made it pretty clear already that my favorite book from the subscription was The Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi. This is also the best edition, like the best reworked edition from the subscription as well, with the slipcase and the naked hardcover. So this one I feel is the best of the 18 all around in terms of the edition itself and the contents of the book. I have been so disappointed with fantasy books, like new fantasy books recently, listening to the hype, listening to people say they're amazing, and I have to say I have noticed that expectation is an issue for me. If you tell me this is the best fantasy book you've read this year, I will mentally hold you to that as I'm reading, and if it's not the best fantasy book that I've read this year, then I'm going to be disappointed, just because I had a level of expectation going into the book. I had no expectations going into this one and it absolutely blew me away. It is a 4-star, not a 5, so not like one of the best books I've ever read, and that is consistent for the sequel as well. I also gave that 4, but definitely I think worth a read if you haven't given this one a try yet. If you are a fan of like Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters, or potentially something like the City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, I feel like this one is going to be one that you potentially really enjoy. And something that I really liked about this one is that it has a very self-contained plot in the first one. It's about people separated by blood, there's lots of oppression, we're trying to break the system, you know, those classic fantasy themes, with a set of like a tournament, a set of trials in here as well. And then the second book, after you've got used to the characters, you've got to know them, the political system is established, you know what's going on, the second book zooms out and the world is so much bigger. So this is definitely 100% my favorite book of the 18. But the most surprising is one that I predicted would be my least favorite of the 3 when I read it in the vlog installment. I feel like you guys, some of you guys know that this is coming. It's the embroidered book by Kate Hartfield, because if you know me, you will know I don't like historical fiction. I no interest in historical fiction at all. But over the last couple of years, or when I've looked back at books that I've read and enjoyed, I've discovered that I actually do like historical fantasy, depending on how it's done. And this one, the synopsis of this, based on me being somebody who doesn't like historical fiction, this seems so boring and so not anything that I would be interested in. But this book has lived in my mind rent-free since I finished it. So the embroidered book is kind of the story of Marie Antoinette and her sister if they had magic. So there is a book of magic that they find and they start to do spells. And this book starts off when they're children. Marie Antoinette obviously goes on to become the Queen of France. We all know what happens to Marie Antoinette, and her sister Charlotte goes to Napoli. As the tension is rising across Europe, as royalty are being like dethroned and beheaded left, right and center, these two sisters are using magic to help their people, but they're also kind of working against each other because of the countries that they're representing. I didn't know what Kate Hartfield's aim was, and I still don't know when she wrote this book. Like, I don't know what her intention was, but this got me interested in a period of history that I only really knew the basics of. It also made these historical figures that I don't really know much about feel like real people, and this has quite a sympathetic take on Marie Antoinette. So I don't doubt that there is like a whole ton of liberties that were taken with the history of this and the kind of people that Marie Antoinette and her sister were. This was such a riveting story that I loved and still think about to this day. I would reread this book, and it is a 700-page very historical fantasy that is more historical than fantasy, and I ate this up. With my intent when I purchased this subscription to expand my horizons a little bit, read fantasy that I wouldn't necessarily be picking up on my own, I feel like this subscription definitely did do that for me, and I learned a few things about myself along the way. Firstly, I found out that there are only specific types of fantasy that I like, because a lot of these are types of fantasy that I generally wouldn't pick up. I don't really love a standalone fantasy, which I did know, but this kind of reinforced it because they just don't stick in my mind, you know. I like my stories, my plots to be more sweeping, larger, more complicated than you typically get in a standalone. And I also favor epic fantasy. Now, that isn't like exclusive. There are other types of fantasy that I enjoy, or certain books from other subgenres of fantasy that I enjoy, but generally I would say that I am an epic fantasy and a fantasy romance girl at heart. I feel like the focus of Goldsboro, like I feel like every subscription box that I get, while they do a range of books, there are certain books where like, especially like if you think of Fairy Loot, I can look at releases and think like this is a book that I imagine Fairy Loot will do. When I'm looking at pre-orders, I'm like, I feel like this could be a book in an Illumicrate. So I feel like the types of books that Goldsboro lean towards are standalone fantasies, fantasies that feel a little bit more literary. They don't do too much epic fantasy. It's almost a balance with outliers, but it's almost a balance between more literary, thoughtful fantasy and more fast-paced, fun stories that I enjoy when I'm reading. But ultimately, like I'm not somebody, I know people, there are people out there that aren't me, that read for enjoyment. Like if you're having a good time when you're reading a book, then that is enough. I want a little bit more than that. Like I want books to blow me away with the plot twist, with the character development and like the depth of plot. So fun stories like that, while I do also enjoy them, I do also forget about them quickly, so they're not my preference. I would potentially like to have seen a little bit more epic fantasy in this, a little bit more grimdark, potentially a little smidge of fantasy romance, but that's just not what the Goldsboro subscription is, you know. If I want epic fantasy, I can always look at Broken Binding. If I want fantasy romance, I have Fairy Lou, and I have to respect that the Goldsboro subscription is what it is, and what it is not necessarily for me. Now, like I said, I am still signed up, I'm still utilizing my skips because there are outliers. There are books that I've received since I finished the books for this series that I genuinely wanted, so I got the Goldsboro edition. The December book is Sarah Ella Reefy's new book, Feybound, which is also going to be in another subscription, but I loved this so much that I wouldn't mind having two really gorgeous editions of that book. So there are definitely outliers in here, but I don't think that we can deny the overwhelming evidence that the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship is not worth my money. And so eventually, when I run out of skips, because they are going to reset in January, I am going to be cancelling this subscription, which is sad because FOMO is real and we are all a victim. Well, we're not, but I am a victim of FOMO. But the overwhelming evidence, like this is why I did this, because I cannot argue with the evidence. Really enjoying 4 out of 18 books is not a good ratio. And I know people who love the Goldsboro subscription, who the fantasy provided in the Goldsboro subscription is the kind of fantasy they want. So this is a subscription that is definitely for other people. I just don't really think it's for me, because keeping 4 out of 18 books is just not enough. Now, I do think that there is potential in the subscription. I love the exclusivity of Goldsboro. That is a big draw for me, because in a world where we have like thousands of special editions, a book has been released for 1 year and there's a special edition. Waterstones are up in their game and their special editions are almost as good as like subscription box special editions. I appreciate the exclusivity of Goldsboro because it is capped at 2,000, where other subscription boxes send out many more books per month. I also feel like people who like more standalone fantasy, people who like both very slow-paced fantasy and also very fast-paced fantasy, I feel like there are books here for you to enjoy. It's just sadly not a subscription for me. I don't think this is a subscription for you if you, like me, really love epic fantasy and fantasy romance. But maybe if you're looking to push yourself outside of your comfort zone a little bit like I was, maybe you'd like to give the Goldsboro subscription a try. Thank you guys for bearing with me. I hope you guys enjoyed this vlog project. I am looking at starting something similar now that I've finally put a wrap on this one. My issue is that I have a lot of excitement when I'm starting projects, and I normally give 100% until the project is 95% complete, and then I cannot for the life of me finish that last 5%, which is why the last vlog and this wrap up took so long to get to you. But I'm hoping to do something similar in the future and be a little bit more consistent with it, so do keep your eyes peeled for that if you have enjoyed this series. As we all know, I do get a lot of subscription boxes. A lot of them now I do pay for myself, so I really should be holding myself accountable to reading those, shouldn't I? But down in the comments, let me know if you agree with me. Let me know if you have read any of these books, if you're a GSFF member. Let me know your experience with it, especially if you are a GSFF subscriber and you want to give your perspective on it, maybe for some of the people who are here to find out if the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship is worth their money, just to give a little bit of a different perspective. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Kindle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. So that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.